Do we know who wrote Job? Given his character as poetry, should we view it as being about a historical person?
Okay, this was more than 2 weeks ago now. I think this question was from 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I can't remember that far back.
We'll have to save that one for next time.
Okay, so Job. So the authorship of Job. So when I was a senior at Dallas Seminary, majoring in Hebrew, I took an exegetical class in Hebrew from a professor from Harvard on Job. And so we had lots of discussions about Job as we studied it. So there's a lot of discussion about like the dating of Job, the authorship of Job, etc. Okay, so some people place the book written after the exile, some place it before the exile. You know, some place it around the Solomonic area. So there's no really, no one really knows like when to really definitively date that book because it's hard to do. So you look for internal evidence that might point to you to a date. So internal evidence would say there is no Levitical discussion in that book. So meaning anything about Levitical worship system, the temple, sacrifices, anything like that's totally missing from the book. And because that's missing from the book, what would that mean to you?
Hard to place.
You couldn't place it. You would have to place it before Moses, because Moses instituted a Levitical sacrifice, which became intrinsic to the entire Jewish culture. So the book was probably written about a real character named Job prior to Moses, probably during the patriarchal period. So like if Abraham was around 2200 BC, that's the patriarchal period. Job was probably back then, because he doesn't mention the typical things that you would find in a book written that had the Jewish law about it. I mean, he doesn't mention the Torah and things like that. In Job chapter 1 verse 5, Job is offering sacrifices for his family. Well, that's not how you did it. When the Torah came along, the law came along, the priest offered the sacrifices. You see? So this must have been prior to that, which would have been prior to Moses. So Moses was, 1446 BC was probably the date of the Exodus. So sometime before that was Job. Genesis and Job 1:3, his wealth is given in terms of cattle, which is how they would deem a person's stature in the patriarchal period. Like when you talk about Abraham was wealthy. Well, how was he wealthy? Well, he was wealthy by means of herds. So the more sheep, the more goat, the more cattle. That's not how we do it today.
That might come into play again soon, though. Surely, sit tight.
Since your stock portfolio just went up. But so it has language of patriarchal type language, of the dating of it. They don't know like exactly who wrote it, like per se. But they're based on some of that internal evidence. It's believed to be a patriarchal origin. Okay, so he probably lived. Scholars believe he probably lived around the second millennium, which is going to be the patriarchal period. Now, okay. What I did find in Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 12 to 16, God is castigating the Israelites for rejecting him, and so God gets so fed up in the time of Ezekiel that he's telling, hey, judgment's going to come, and your enemy's going to kill this city. And basically, I am so upset with the fact that you have disregarded my word for all these years. I've reached the end of what I will put up with. And so I'm going to judge you with captivity. So in chapter 14, God says this, and this relates to Job, which I'll tell you the significance in a minute. So in Ezekiel chapter 14, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, and he said, Son of man, when a land sins against me, acting faithlessly, and I stretch out my hand against it, and I break its supply of bread, and I send famine upon it, and cut off from it man and beast, even if these three men came back, Noah, Daniel, and Job, they would be delivered, but their own lives by their righteousness, declares the Lord. But he says, I will not deliver you. So he said, you have so sinned against me as a nation, which is still kind of applicable today.
Mm-hmm.
You have so sinned against me, and shook your fist in my face. I'm going to judge you with captivity, and even if you could bring back your 3 big spiritual heavy hitters, 3 real people, not fictitious poetical people, Noah, Daniel the prophet, and Job. God says, I would deliver them. I would not spare you as a nation. And so how do we know that Job was a real character? Because Ezekiel the prophet, by way of divine inspiration, speaking for God, identifies him as a real person. So he wasn't a poetical device, to answer the question. What was the other part of her question? I think that was the first part.
Yeah, given his character as poetry, should we view it as being about a historical person? So.
Okay.
So do we know who wrote Job?
We don't know who wrote it. And yes, he was a real person because the reason I just stated. And I would say, the book is more than just a poetical book. It's classified as wisdom literature. So wisdom literature can contain poetical structure, figures of speech, which we'll talk about as we study Psalms. In fact, after we get finished with Psalms, you'll know figures of speech. But and we've already been talking about chiastic structure, and then I introduced merism this week. Stating 2 opposite poles, like hook, line, and sinker. It's the whole enchilada. Those are all merisms. So the book of Job is a wisdom document designed to get you wise, and it might have figures of speech in it to drive the points home. But because it uses figures of speech in a poetical way, it doesn't mean that they're not real.
Okay.
Like, if I'm a car salesman and you come to me to buy a car, and the car is worth $40,000 and I get you to buy it for $45,000, and I go tell my sales buddy, man, you can't believe it. That lady came in here with her husband, and I got her to buy that thing for $45,000, hook, line, and sinker. What does that mean? You just got took. And I just made $5,000 profit, but it doesn't mean that event didn't happen.
Right.
So you can't just think because it's poetical that it didn't happen. And wisdom literature doesn't mean by definition it wasn't historical. So wisdom literature is designed to make you wise by an analysis. So when you read Job, you have multiple speech cycles with his friends, Bildad, Elihu, Zophar, all of his friends, trying to counsel and console him. You have these 3 real discussions that any friend would have with a friend in trauma, trying to help him. You have Elihu, his friend, coming and trying to give the ultimate counsel, and he's not even totally right. And then finally God shows up and spends several chapters telling Job, who do you think you are to ask me questions about what's going on in your life? Of course I'm with you. Trust me, So there's nothing about the book that smacks that it's not historical. It has everything about historicity about it, because these 3 friends are trying to console their good friend who was very wealthy and lost everything about how to get his life back in line and why all this might be happening to him. So there's nothing about it that sounds like it's legendary or fictitious.
Right.
It's embedded in history. And then who hasn't had things like that happen to you?
Yeah, it sounds like life every day.
Like we were going along just fine. My wife and I got back from Israel, and we went out to, what was it, Bonefish one night, because we had somebody gave us a gift card, went out for dinner one night when we got back from Israel, and then right after that, they shut the whole country down. I'm like, huh? And now it's like, I have all these gift cards in a plastic baggie that we've been collecting all year.
Cattle is going to be
can't use the gift cards. And I was like, gotta be kidding me. So I can relate to Job. Yeah. So anyway, real person, don't know who wrote it, probably a patriarchal period, and it is probably the oldest book in the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament is not to put together in a chronological format per se. So Job is probably the book that is before Genesis as far as chronology.
Okay.
You follow? Because Moses wrote Genesis. So if Moses was 1446 BC and Job was 2200 BC, you see what I mean? And that's just a Bible trivia thing.
Thanks.